gone from 2020 to 2021. So with that in mind, I'll give a brief overview. I've added a bonus game into my talk, haha, that some of the slide titles will be a direct or a near direct reference to a song lyric. So your challenge is, can you name the artist that the song lyric comes from? So you have to think about the song, but then go back to the artist. So we'll see how familiar you are with various bits of pop through the ages. So 2020, a good year gone wrong. We had a fantastically ambitious plan for 2020. Our fieldwork was largely scheduled. We were going to start in late March at Port Carlisle, and then COVID hit. And so kind of up to the final wire in kind of early to mid-March, we decided for safety, no, we really can't run our 2020 fieldwork. That had a whole bunch of implications. It has a whole bunch of implications for us as a project. And we'll talk about that a little bit further, but we did have this lovely plan for 2020. We're very sorry that we've not been able to put it into practice for everyone, really. So there were a number of changes that we saw throughout the year. So initially there's some staff changes. So Nikki Garland and Paul Frobstrom left the project, but we've been joined, and I think all of you have now met, Catherine Murphy, our project support officer, and Dr. Jane Harrison, who's our community archaeologist. They both started in September, and they both hit the ground running. They came on with a lot of energy, and what's great is how much they've joined in the project, even though they've never actually been on the university campus, and we've not really had an opportunity to gather as a full team since they've started either. So we're all looking forward to the day when we can meet again. The main change that we had in this past year was really a pivot to the digital. So we've done a number of things that I know many of you were part of. We started with a GIS exercise to gather data about mile castles and turrets that we can start adding into the GIS. We launched the book club, which many have taken part in, and there's been some great comments around some of what we've read. Carrie and Marianne have started the tea breaks, just a chance for us all to catch up. And then of course, we've got our online kind of winter training, as it were, and various other talks. So those will continue. We also have a slightly revised volunteer portal, which I'm hoping some of you have been able to explore. And part of the reason for that revision is just to be able to account better for those households where there are two of you in the same household or sharing the same bubble. It made no sense for you to both be registered on the portal, so we can just register you as a household. So some of those are mostly just technical changes to make it better for you, but also easier for us as well to stay in contact. So the big question is really what to expect in 2021. To some extent, as much as we can plan, we still have to be very adaptive and reactionary, I suppose, to government guidelines, and also partly to some of the university guidelines as well, in terms of, you know, our insurance for running activities comes through the university. So your health is one of our top concerns, and so we're always going to respond with that in mind. We will continue to deliver things digitally as long as necessary. So as well as maintaining, say, for example, the training program we have, book club, there's now the screen club being launched. There's other kind of new offers and ventures that are on the way. So we're always open-minded, and I'm sure if you have ideas, I'm hoping that you feel confident that you can share them with us. But yeah, we do always welcome those ideas. We really genuinely want to be able to get back in the field and have in-person delivery and in meetings as soon as possible. But of course, that will have to wait for when it's safe. So we're always keeping our ears to the ground, listening to the news, having discussions about what we think is likely to happen and what scenarios will be. You know, of course, Boris's unofficial comments in just recent days is a further thing for us to reflect on in terms of our planning. So when it comes to actual fieldwork or in-person events, we've been planning for 4 possible circumstances. Our preferred option is number 1, where we have normal conditions, where we can have any members of the team and all volunteers out and at a site at a location. More likely is when there's more restricted conditions that there'd be WallCAP team and perhaps limited numbers of volunteers. Currently, where we're at now is in numbers 3 and 4, where we have highly restricted conditions in which only the WallCAP team can do something, or we're actually even having to hire professionals to do the work for us, and digital delivery. So, whenever we plan any field work, this is a discussion we have of, can we deliver it under circumstance 1? Can we deliver under circumstance 2? And what can we deliver under circumstances 3 and 4? And that's been part of our decision-making process over past months and in the weeks, maybe months going forward. And part of the reason I'm telling you that is just so you know that we are thinking about how we can deliver in a way that's safe for everyone, and that we are considering where we need to make adjustments because of our limitations in delivery. And that's part of our regular, if not daily, certainly weekly conversations. So what can we expect to see in 2021? Well, there will be new online training and learning opportunities. We are very excited that we have a new app that should be ready in a number of weeks that will allow you to, while you're doing your daily exercise, you can go out and take photographs of kind of buildings or local monuments and upload those photographs to create a 3D model. We will see at some point in 2021 at various times the launch of exhibitions at the GNM, the SIL, and Telehouse venues. And where possible, we're trying to be inclusive about that. One of the challenges there is that those museums are actually much more sensitive to furlough schemes, government furlough schemes and closure. And so that's been impacting on the time frame for those projects. And also, of course, we certainly will be doing field work. We don't know how yet, and that will be done subject to the latest government guidance. That is kind of most of what I can say in general. Just to give you a little bit of taster, we're expecting to be able to get to Port Carlisle, where there's an issue with exposed and deteriorating wall that needs some consolidation, and there's issues of farm access. So we need to undertake some archaeological evaluation, consolidate the wall there, install a new gate. This is something that might seem familiar from last year. So if you're having a Groundhog Day experience, well, that's why. We are also hoping to get back to Cambeck. We had limited trenches initially, and it was a lovely spot that many of us enjoyed, but actually there are still more questions that we need to resolve. And ideally that will be excavation. We're also hoping that we can get back to Corbridge. And actually the Corbridge is quite good because it potentially allows us the largest number of volunteers. So if we have to be doing social distancing and wearing a mask, which I think is probably a realistic expectation, that actually we have the most space at Corbridge, and hopefully that should allow the most opportunities for everyone. We also, in terms of SSD, so those were kind of just a few of the things we want to do for HAR, but for SSD, we want to get back out to look at quarries and rock faces and examine that geology very directly. We want to get back to sites, Roman sites along the wall, and have you looking at that Roman carved stone. How big is it? What type of geology is it? Are there any exceptions? Continue with that recording. And also looking at buildings and structures which have reused wall stone and recording those. And in those last two, we also are hoping in the spring to be able to launch an archive exercise that we can have done in a very safe way, and hopefully digitally, in which you can start searching archives for information that will help with particular case studies and areas and enrich our understanding of what's happened in that area in terms of quarrying, in terms of the wall, in terms of stone use.
About from September onwards when I joined the project, but I can just say already that I have thoroughly enjoyed what has happened so far, despite it being in slightly odd circumstances. But I'm so looking forward to meeting a lot more of you volunteers and to working with you in person. So I'm really hoping that our fieldwork plans will be able to be carried out in some way or another. So I arrived in September, and I spent September just getting back to learning the landscape again and doing some recce's and thinking about the way forward in slightly challenging circumstances. We often had 3 plans running at the same time, not knowing which of them we'd be able to roll out in the field. But we did manage to do some work on one excavation and also to complete some much needed repair and consolidation with Gary Simpson and his Heritage Consolidation gang. So I'm going to talk first about the excavation at Walltown Crags, and that's us underway inside that red circle. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the repair and consolidation work that was done at Walltown Crags after we'd finished digging, at Mucklebank Turret, and in that most popular central section at Peel Gap and Cat Stairs. And I'd like to say thank you to those of you who did make it out when we were working. It was lovely to meet a few of you in a socially distanced way. Okay, so first of all, the excavation, which was located here, east of the Greenhead Quarry, which leaves that gap in the wall, with the site of Mile Castle 45 just to the east and Mucklebank Turret 44B up on the crag beyond Walltown Nick. It's a rugged stretch, you will all know it as you saw on that first slide, with the wall running sort of relatively sinuously along the crag crest. We worked there for 8 days, and until the day before, I think it was, we were supposed to be working with you, and then everything changed. And so in the end, it was me and Catherine with welcome help from Rob. Okay, so why were we there? We were there because, as you can see from this slide, there was relatively loose core material on top of the wall that needed consolidating, and there was also some repair of slipped facing stones that need to be done. But it was also an opportunity for us to try and to understand more of the construction and the history of the narrow wall in this location, and also to try and find out more about an earlier excavation for which no records remain. And here on the slide, you can see the ditch and the bank of that Edwardian excavation that basically ran along the southern face of the wall for about 30, just over 30 meters, 32 meters. And it runs to just a few meters east of the point where the wall disappears into the quarry. Now, our two trenches, which we completed, were trench 1 here, and that's just east of the end of the ditch and bank, and we just caught the rounded end of the spoil bank in that trench, but the rest of it ran north over an area undisturbed by the Edwardian excavation, over the wall and down onto the other face. So we were excavating a bit of the wall that had been buried, the curtain, for some time. Trench 2 was across half of the Edwardian bank in this location here, and ran across the ditch and up to the southern face of the wall. So what did we learn in the excavation? It provided that rare opportunity to look at the construction of the narrow curtain wall, in particular here in trench 1, where it had been buried for some time. And what we were able to uncover was 1 footings course, 5 complete courses, 1 partial, and 2 stones of a 7th course. You can see the very familiar rough squared Carboniferous sandstone, except that it's not as weathered. It's sharper and crisper and does contrast quite a good deal to the smoother stones to the east and the west of it that have been exposed for longer. Now, there's 1 rogue stone here, which was a sort of orangey pink sparkly rock, probably igneous, and possibly from quite a bit further afield than the Carboniferous sandstone. Now, Ian can speculate more about that. But interesting that there was this 1 different stone. And that footings course, the excavation suggested that this had been buried after the wall was constructed, so that the wall would have been visible from here on upwards. We didn't see any evidence for repair. We didn't find any evidence for bonding. And what we also found were phases of collapsing to the south of the wall here, possibly after an initial major dismantling, and then perhaps 1 or 2 major collapses or a sequence of smaller collapses. And I think you can in this section here at the top left, you can almost see the dynamics of the collapsing in that section drawing. Some of it was more like slumping. There was a curve of 3 slipped facing stones that had just dislodged out of the wall and slipped over previous collapse. And then things quietened down and a turf forms over those earlier collapses. The spoil bank is, the Edwardian spoil bank is dug out and popped on top of that turf. So we know that there was a phase of collapse before the Edwardian excavation, and then we get another phase of collapsing that happens after the spoil bank has been created. And it may have been that Edwardian excavation actually helped destabilize the wall. It sort of destabilized the wall, and that second collapse is partly that. Now, the narrow wall is often quoted as being about 2.29 meters wide. We reckon this stretch is about 2.18 meters wide, so sort of in line with that. And the foundations elsewhere have been seen set in clay and sealed with clay, but not here. The footings course was directly onto the bedrock, and the bedrock here was very crisp, very flat, and very unweathered. And the size of the stones in the regular courses was maybe a little bit larger than the average that David Breeze suggests at 5 by 15 by 25 centimeters, but not far off. So the north face, and you can see here, Catherine, who looks as if she's about to slide down a precipice, carefully unpicking what we could do on what was virtually a cliff face. There was one point when we were digging and we looked up and there were helicopters flying below us in front of the cliff. And Catherine could only reveal one course, as you see in this photo, because to dig any more would have been to destabilize that face of the wall. So we revealed one new course and the top of one below. Now, the footings course have been, the facing courses have been lost to a much lower level at the north. And by comparing levels with the north faces and the south, it suggests that there's one more regular course and then a footings course below that surviving. There's been perhaps more gradual slumping down the crack under the effects of being more exposed and on a slight curve of the wall on that crag top. Now, trench 2, the Edwardian spoil bank, which you can see in section here, was more eroded, but the wall was again built directly onto exposed bedrock. But in this location, I think you can see here, all of these are columns of bedrock, but they're really, really weathered, very different in appearance to the bedrock in trench 1. And because it's so uneven and must have been exposed, I think, when the wall was built, the footings courses above are very different in trench 1 to cope with that unevenness. So you get these funny little leveling chock stones here. So it seemed that the Roman, the builders, had constructed the Walltown Crags stretch of wall on the edge of the crags and directly onto bedrock where possible. And they must have first cleared the ground when they were laying the footings along the planned line of the structure and then built directly onto already exposed bedrock, but also onto newly exposed bedrock. And it wasn't clear whether that digging down was within a foundation trench or simply rough clearing. And it seems that the intention was to maximize the crag location, but also to attempt to keep those footings on the solid bedrock. So after excavation, Gary Simpson and his heritage consolidation crew came out and worked at the top of the wall, putting in turf to help consolidate it and repairing the top of the south face in trench 1 to replace the slipstones. And then they also repaired the corner of Mucklebank Turret, as you can see on the slide here, which had been needed doing for quite some time. So the work now at Walltown Crags is finished. Now, they also did a number of other stretches of repair and consolidation in Peel Gaps and at Cat Stairs in the central section. that section where there is much walking on the wall, but also quite a lot of posing to take photos. You can see where people have climbed up and stood and walked along to get that perfect shot. And one of the two major repairs, one was a repair at Peel Gap, one was a repair at Cat Stairs, followed by that turf-based consolidation of the top of the wall to give it a different rounded profile that was intended to deter people from climbing up onto the wall. So here you can see it at Peel Gap, that's the repair in progress, because they have to strip down to a stable layer of facing stones in order to be able to rebuild the wall. And the interesting thing about the Peel Gap repair was that when they got down, you can see here, there's an in situ footings course, most likely, with some possible mortar surviving, from which I took a sample. So that was really interesting to see. And here you can, this is what that section looked like after they'd finished doing their repairs. And at Cat Stairs, it was a little bit different, because it was clear once they started to unravel the wall before rebuilding that it had been done before, because there was teram in waterproof fabric in the center of the wall. I think you can just about see it here. So it was a collapse of a previous repair. And here you can see some of the other long stretches that were consolidated on the west face of the Peel Gap. And finally, their rather nice solution to people who, this is the road running up to the Steel Rig car park, and the wall end butts against the dry stone wall, and people had spotted it and hopped over the dry stone wall, which used to run at this level, and walked and stood on that end of the wall in order to take photographs. The solution was to actually raise the dry stone wall in order to protect that end. So those are the things that we managed to do in autumn, before everything got too wet and claggy. But this was us last year, recording, drawing. It was us last year, and this year we hope it's going to be all of us and you out there doing the same. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you all again. So just a quick run through what's been going on with stone sourcing and dispersal, and also to bring it up to date. I'm very pleased to be able to bring this particular presentation to you from Nepal. So that's Manaslu sitting behind me, the 8th highest mountain in the world, and one of the ultimate stone sources in the globe. You have never seen so much aggregate in your life in the valleys below that particular mountain. Anyway, I distracted myself from the purpose at hand. So stone sourcing and dispersal. And what I would like to do to take us through this is just to start off by going back to the 4 major steps that we're trying to achieve through the stone sourcing and dispersal project. And then to look at each of those steps and to give a bit of a view about what we've done, and more particularly where we're going to be heading this year in terms of what I sincerely hope we will be able to do, and things that we actually definitely will be able to do as well, and maybe some things which are in between that. So as you know, there are 4 parts to this. The first is about understanding the geology, and looking at the wall, both from the perspective of understanding the geological processes that have gone on to create the rocks and the landscapes, but also to try and get an understanding of the Roman perspective on the way in which they may have viewed the geology as a resource, and also to understand a bit about what the landscape would have been like at the time that the Romans were putting the wall in place. The second part is to actually investigate in detail at the wall, to go and have a look at the wall and dwell both on the archaeological form of the building material in parallel with looking at the individual blocks of that stone to understand what it's made of, as well as the shapes that human hands, Roman hands, have turned them into. And then to take that knowledge of the geology and what's actually in the wall to see if we can work out what some of the sources for the wall's rock might have been. and I'll explore that a little bit more when we get to that particular point. And then finally, the ultimate purpose of this particular project, to see if we can understand where the Roman material has been reused within a wide range of buildings within the communities across the length of the wall. So that the advent of COVID has meant that my first and best preference for the way to see and understand geology, which is by going and looking at rocks, has been somewhat undermined. And sadly, we've only been able to get out on one field trip during the year, albeit that was a glorious opportunity to wander down the Hawk Whistle Burn and look at the fantastic selection of Carboniferous rocks which can be seen there, as well as to spend a bit of time looking at the windsill, which is wonderfully exposed in the Caulfields Quarry at the head of the burn there. And what it has meant is that quite a bit of the understanding of the geology has been taking place in a combination of ways, which I will come back to in a moment. Now, one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next few weeks for definite is some more online understanding of the geology. Firstly, with this gentleman, Dr. Stuart Jones of Durham University, who next week is going to be taking us an online tour of the beautiful red sandstones in the western part of the Walls corridor. So looking at the St. Bees sandstone and what that's all about. Extremely knowledgeable sedimentologist, and I'm sure he'll give us a really interesting talk on that. And following on from that, in February, these two characters, so Kees van der Land on the left and Sanne Eisikelin on the right, will be giving us various talks. Kees is an expert on carbonate geology and Sanne is an expert on sandstone geology. And both of them are going to be giving an interesting spin on this, which is going to relate the sedimentary material which we can find within the Hadrian's corridor to some of the more contemporary uses and the contemporary value of those resources within our communities today. And I'm really looking forward to both of those talks, which I think will be a really interesting twist on what the geology of the corridor is actually about. I'm also proposing to give some more online talks myself, and there are various potential subjects around that, and one of those is to actually look at the wealth of fossils which you can find within the geology of the wall. So here's some examples, some marine fossils that you can find within the limestones, and also some of the plant fossils which you might be able to find as well. And I think an exploration of that, and particularly in conjunction with some of the really nice collections that can be found, for example, at Tully House, I think will be an interesting thing to explore. And inevitably there are a whole bunch more options for things that I can do as online talks, should it prove that we don't have the opportunity of actually doing what I think is the best thing, which is actually going and looking at these rocks in the field. Assuming we have the opportunity, that there are many walks that I would like to do, and one of those, I would like to repeat the walk to Caulfields and Hawk Whistle, because I think it explains so much about the rocks that we can find within the Hadrian's Wall corridor. St. Bees, we may not be able to get to, but I would definitely like to take a walk out to the Pennine coal measures, which are fantastically exposed in the coastal section between Tynemouth going up to Cullercoats and a bit beyond. There's some really good geology to explore there. And again, in terms of understanding the geology which underpins the eastern section of the wall, this is a really invaluable place to explore. And finally, I would like, if we can, to go out to Rockcliffe, which is a set of exposures on the northern coast of the Solway Firth, which will take us a bit outside of the geology of the Hadrian's Wall corridor. However, I think there's two things which are important about this exposure. One is it gives a bit of an insight, that a good way of understanding what's going on in a particular location is to actually move away from that location and try and understand how the geology which is around and about actually helps explain the processes and context of what's going on. within the Hadrian's Wall corridor, and Rockcliffe will allow us to do that. The other thing which I think is important about this is one of the considerations about the way in which geological material has been transported in order to place it on Hadrian's Wall. And one of those possible routes is by boat. And the Solway Firth is, as far as a boat traveller is concerned, is an easy way of moving material from one location to another. I think that's something which would merit exploring. And just to go back over some of the things that we've done by way of online work, which I propose to keep going with, is that there are a whole series of blogs which I'm hoping at least some of you have read, and if you haven't, do go and check them out. There's a lot of background material here about various different aspects of the geology. And those blogs have been linked to the literary rock competitions within the newsletter, and I'm proposing to keep going with those. They've certainly given me a degree of entertainment in terms of actually writing them, and I hope that they've provided a little bit of an insight into other aspects of the geology of the Hadrian's Wall corridor as we've gone along as well. So that's what has been happening and will be happening with the understanding the geology. And so to investigating the wallstone, we've had a bit of a dry period as far as that's concerned during this last year, because it has been so difficult to actually get out and work on the wall. And I hope that will change. And as Rob has already alluded to, there are two different ways in which that might change. One is, again, best option is that we can all go out there and do the work on it. The other is that if it's really not possible to do that, that I as an individual or working with the rest of the WallCAP team may well be able to do the work to carry on the investigation of the wallstone. And there are plenty of locations for us to go and look at. Just as an aside, one of the things which I would like to do with all of these remaining stages, has already been having conversations with Jane about this, is to make sure that the locations that we pick for going out and doing both the investigation of the wall, the unearthing of the wall stones, and the repurposing of wall stones are done in such ways that they mirror the sets of excavations that are going to go on with heritage at risk, so that we've got an ability to be able to directly compare what's going on with the SSD strand of this work with what's going on with the heritage at risk strand of the work, so that we can see the way in which those two pieces of work join up with each other. So for investigating the wall, that Heddon, I believe, is due a revisit, that we've not actually done the detailed work on this wall, albeit we have done some training exercises here. So I would like to go back to Heddon. And I think working across the wall, that other possible locations that we could go and visit are here at Plane Trees, just down from Heavenfield. Chester's is certainly due a visit, and I think that there are some quite exciting things we can do as far as investigating the wall and mixing that in with some work on investigating sources, and also maybe doing some more stonework in terms of actually hitting some pieces of rock with hammers and chisels as well, which we'll come on to in a moment. Also, Housesteads is another iconic location that there is more investigation of the curtain wall that we can do there. And at Walltown as well, and I'll come back to Walltown in a moment, and also at Bird Oswald as well, which I think is the last, yes, that's the most westerly of the locations. We've already really had a look at Hare Hill, which is the most westerly of the reasonably exposed parts of the wall to investigate. So I think Bird Oswald offers plenty of opportunity, not only around the fort, but also leading down to the Willowford crossing and looking at some of the fantastic sections of wall down there as well. As part of this, I just also wanted to remind you, and again, I'm hoping that many of you will have had a good mosey around this collection of guides, which were written specifically to give some background and also some specific ideas about how to approach doing investigation of the wall stone. And if you have had a quick browse, or indeed if you've not had a look at them yet, can I commend these to you to have a really good look through and get into your heads as good preparation work before we can get out into the field. So those are the SSD guides, which are readily available on the volunteer portal. And in parallel with this, I would also like to point out that we will be doing, as a team, as an individual, I will be doing various pieces of data collection. So I'll be using the PXRF, which is this wonderful device on the left here, to collect lots of data. I've been busily doing some of this in lockdown, so I was able to analyse some of the wall rock that was exposed at Walltown during Jane and Catherine's excavation there. And I also have a combination, 2 sets of different types of sample at home. One of rocks which I have collected on previous projects, which have already been analysed. And I've reanalysed them using this particular device so that I can make sure that the way in which the machine is calibrated is good, and that it will help to improve the precision and accuracy of the data which we can get out from the machine. And I also have a number of samples which I've collected both from the wall and from potential sources of material for the wall, which I'm in the process of working my way through to get the data analysis of those done. And one of the things that we'll be doing to add to that during the year is we'll be taking thin sections of some of these rocks so that we can do some petrographic analysis. And that work, and I talk a bit about that within the SSD guides to explain a bit more about how that works and what the relationship is between the sort of work which you can do as volunteers in terms of actually examining the rocks to understand what they're about, and how that is complemented by this geochemical and petrological work. And so to unearthing the wall's rocks. As with the first year, that there are some things that I would like to repeat and expand further by way of practically going and doing things with rocks. So actually the stone carving workshop that we ran a few years ago, I would like to repeat, to give an opportunity to get a sense of what it feels like to work with stone, to get inside the Roman head of how different types of rock actually respond and what you can do with them. And similarly with the trip we did to Ladycross, I would like, if we can, to get back there again, and I'll talk a little bit more about more we can do there. But also, so Ladycross, and also to Barrisford Quarries, another place which I've made contact with the quarry manager there, and I'm hoping, and again it's going to be absolutely dependent on the way in which their lockdown rules will change over time as to whether we can do that or not. But there is a fantastic exposure there of the windsill against some of the country rock, which I think will be really interesting to look at, and to look at the way that different types of rock behave within a quarried environment. So the other thing to say, I'm going to go back a slide here, is that, as Rob has already talked about, there is going to be some an archival project which is well underway in terms of defining how that's going to work, which will give an opportunity to do some background work offline, online, to understand what archival material might tell us more about the way in which stone has been moved around, maybe in post-Roman times, and also where quarrying work has been carried out along the Hadrian's Wall corridor. So we will see more of that in the coming year. So that's unearthing the wall's rocks, and finally investigating repurposed wall stone. And again, we've got plenty of things to look at here, and as I said earlier, I would like to tie this in with the Heritage at Risk work. So I have a number of locations that I think would be of interest. So Here's one just outside Brampton, which I think would tie in nicely with the Canbeck work. This is the old church just outside Brampton, which looks like it has a fairly significant amount of Roman material in it. So I think this will be one really good location to go and look at. Another one to tie in with Port Carlisle and the Drumborough dig is Drumborough House itself, Drumborough Castle, which is a fabulous location. Again, a lot of Roman material here. There's some unquestionable Roman material in the shape of altars and other material, probably an enormous amount of wall stone. And I think this is a particularly interesting location because it is one of the few locations where we will be able to get more of an insight into what's going on in the western end of the wall, right in the heartland of where the Triassic St. Bees sandstones are located. So I'm particularly looking forward to what we can get out of this location. And yeah, I'm really fond of this particular picture, which is at the bottom of the castle, where you can see these, what in all likelihood are bits of wall stone, which are resting on top of these rounded igneous material, and these are erratics, which have been brought across the Solway Firth by glacial action and dumped. And it's rather nice that these 400 million year old igneous rocks, which have been moved by the ice, have then been built on top of by these more recently moved Roman stones within the castle. So yeah, so that's going to be a good location to go and look at. And similarly, as part of the Corbridge excavation, related to the Corbridge excavation, I think that the parish church in Corbridge, with this fantastic Roman arch inside it, and also the peel tower next door in the churchyard, will be great places to explore for repurposed stone. And I think also finally that there's more work that we can do at Thirlwell. We've already gathered some great data from the castle, but I think there's more that we can do in terms of not only understanding the nature of the wall stone which has been reused in it, but also some of the volumetric information which we can then use to start doing some calculations about how much wall you need to create a castle, and other questions and answers that I think will be of a great deal of interest. So I think I've come to the last, right, okay, I think also Heddon St Andrew's Church. Again, we did a training exercise on that, and I think this is worthy of a revisit. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight into where the stone sourcing and dispersal is heading for next, and happy to answer any questions.